I've now been involved in what some people would call mystical or spiritual exploration for 10 years. Over the course of this decade, I've looked into many theories and paradigms for understanding life's mysteries. Sometimes I find existing paradigms and traditions to be lacking. I often find myself turning inwards to the inward images that come to my mind's eye. From these inward images, I've created some mental maps that I think are helpful for those exploring mysticism and spiritualism in this day and age. This is how the book Sit With It occurred to me. I also reference several inward images in other videos on this channel. I've never been very interested in, or frankly properly educated in, philosophy. Most philosophy seems like an awful web of pedantic intellectualism and linguistic categorization. I do feel aligned with the inspiration behind the word philosophy, which means love of wisdom. In other words, love of Sophia, a feminine representation of divine wisdom. When thinking about what reality is and how it works, I find myself avoiding formal philosophical categorization and typical linguistic descriptions of reality. Instead, I favor this image, the states of water. Now, before I get into it, I'd like to make the point that while this image is inspired by modern science and uses scientific descriptions, I am not speaking literally. I'm not making any scientific or factual claims about the nature of reality in this video. I'm using scientific terminology as a metaphor or analogy to describe a symbolic image that's been helpful to me. The image of different states of water provides me with a helpful representation of an insight that I cannot find described elsewhere to my satisfaction. This question arises during religious, spiritual, mystical, or philosophical exploration. What is the relationship between the physical world we seem to inhabit and the supposed world of spirit? Of course, many folks will tell you the answer to that question is easy. The world of spirit doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. Others will tell you whatever the religious tradition said, with little to no personal experience to back it up. These are people firmly imprinted in the status quo, people without substantial experience of the higher circuits. Frankly, there isn't much one could do or say to change their minds. For those of us that have activated the higher circuits and have had experiences that one could call spiritual or mystical, it's helpful to have an image to make sense of it all in a tangible way. For me, the states of water is such an image. I like to think of the 3 primary states of water in a mandala-like circle. Let's pretend this entire circle is water in various states. The white center represents a source of heat. At the outer edges of the circle, you have ice, frozen water. The water molecules aren't moving. The water becomes solid and cold to the touch. This, to me, is a metaphor for the physical world around us. Let's say at the edges of the circle we can find ice pillars. The ice has cracked and it forms into what seem to be distinct structures. These structures seem to be individual separate pieces, but they in fact consist of water just like the rest of the circle does. Now let's jump to this area. This is water in its gaseous state, which is called water vapor. As vapor, we sometimes can't detect it with our physical senses. This is a metaphor for the world of spirit, or that of the psyche, the mental realm. We can't quite physically sense it, yet somehow we have experiences that point to its existence. Both the ice realm and the vapor realm are made of the same exact type of molecule. It's water. The main difference between the two is that the vapor area is closer to the heat source. This results in those molecules entering a highly excited, fast-moving state. Ice and water vapor are both expressions of the same thing. Now let's look at the area in the middle. This is liquid water. It is the state between ice and vapor. A liquid is quite dynamic. It can be free-flowing and flexible. It can take the shape of the container that it's held in. In some situations, it can be hard as a rock, such as when you belly flop and land hard onto the surface of a pool. Liquid water is a metaphor for the state in between the physical realm and the realm of spirit or psyche. This metaphor has been used in various traditions over the ages. Spiritual alchemists and mystics attempt to transform their experience of the physical world into a more dynamic, liquid experience. When the world around you is experienced as a liquid as opposed to a solid, you can better flow with the parade of experiences that occur to you. We all learn to attach ourselves to the world around us. We grasp desperately to chunks of cold ice. We hope that one day we'll find a permanent structure that we can rely on. But time and time again, this structure melts on us or drifts away. We're often left stranded and isolated on an iceberg like this poor fox. Materialism is the dominant way of looking at the world in this modern age. We mostly experience the world of matter as solid, and our day-to-day lives are spent out here in the ice. The farther we are away from the source, the colder, harder, and more separate we feel from the totality of life. The way to transform our experience of life in a deep and meaningful way is to apply heat. Heat can be understood to be a stimulation of sorts. This stimulation makes water molecules start vibrating. The heat loosens them up. The ice then melts into liquid water. In this metaphor, the excitation of molecules is sort of like what some Hindus call Shakti. Shakti is the energy which brings life to the world, and it's associated with worship of the divine feminine. If you start moving towards the source, the world around you begins to melt a little, and you get a bit closer to the vapor surrounding the source, which is the non-physical world of spirit or psyche. In some traditions, applying this sort of spiritual heat can be called tapas. That's a whole subject on its own, so I'll leave it at that. I could probably end this video here, but I'll indulge in stretching the image, this metaphor, to a breaking point. The fourth state of matter is plasma. Now, I'm not an expert, but Google reminded me that a plasma is what happens when you heat a gas to the point where it becomes electrically charged. Plasmas often give off light and heat. For example, the sun is considered 99.9% plasma. So let's say at the center of our mandala, you'll find water that's been heated to the point of breaking down into hydrogen and oxygen molecules. And for the purposes of this metaphor, the hydrogen molecules have been transformed into plasma. They now give off light and heat. Looking at the entire mandala, you can see we have water in various states of expression. That expression can be changed by changing the water's proximity to the source of light and heat. Since that source of light and heat has come from the very building blocks of water, the light and heat are also water in a certain respect. So every expression of matter in this mandala shares the same essence. I'll now take this metaphor even further and bring in a different flavor. The Holy Trinity is a Christian symbol that describes how God both is and isn't three distinct aspects of divinity. I use our Blue Water States mandala to better appreciate what the Christian theologians were getting at when creating the image of the Holy Trinity. The center of the circle is the source, the light. This is what Christians call God the Father, who is found through the kingdom of heaven, which is vapor in our metaphor. The liquid water is what Christians call the Holy Spirit. As discussed in the Eight Ciruit Yoga series, there are many people, including myself, who accept the idea that the Holy Spirit, the divine mediator between the Father and the material world, was originally considered to be the divine feminine. One could say the liquid water in our metaphor is an expression of the divine feminine. And lastly, the solid ice, the physical world, is the sun. The Divine Father, the source of all, transformed itself into a solid. Some Christian traditions call this the sonship. They teach that Jesus of Nazareth wasn't the only human being on earth who can recognize and represent the Father, and a study of sayings attributed to Jesus demonstrate that he said this himself. According to the canonical Gospel of John, Jesus was here to, quote, "gather together into one the children of God who are scattered." When you've come to the recognition that the entire world is made up of different expressions of the same essence, that recognition can transform your experience of life. This is yoga. Yoga basically means union, and this union is the experience that the physical, the spiritual, and the source are all one living being. This is what C.G. Jung and physicist Wolfgang Pauli called the unus mundus. The ancient Greeks hung a notable saying at the entrance of an important mystical location. The saying is, "Know thyself." This true self-knowledge is the understanding that you and every person, situation, and object in your life are all expressions of one divine essence. Some cultures use the word namaste as a greeting and during farewells. The literal meaning of this word is "I bow to you," but the term can also imply "I bow to the divine in you." So with that, I say, Namaste.